Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So I'm going to assume that we're good to go. My name is Mary Gray, and I'm a senior researcher here at Microsoft Research. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Airi Lampion, who's from the University of Helsinki. She's going to present the work that she's been doing for the last bits of summer, 12 weeks, on couchsurfing and negotiations of collective privacy. Welcome, Airi.
Thanks, Mary. So yeah, as Mary said, I'll be talking about my project that I've done here at MSR this summer, or the past 3 months, and this is the first talk I'm giving on it, so it's all very fresh. Bear with me. And, well, yeah, the topic you can see on the front. So we were looking into couchsurfing and what that kind of a domain of hospitality exchange could tell us about network privacy. So just to get a little bit of an image of who we have in the audience, do we have any couchsurfers in the room? Yeah. And yeah. And how about, are you familiar with what couchsurfing is? Yeah. I'll get back to it in a little bit, but it's good if you have some notion to begin with. And as a technical note, the pictures all come from Flickr's Creative Commons, and they have the credits there, so that's what the weird little words mean. But yeah, let's get started. So first thing to know is that when I'm talking about privacy, I think of it in the sense of boundary regulation, which is different from what a lot of other people do. So boundary regulation basically is this notion Altman came up with in 1975, back in the year where privacy is seen as this interpersonal, interactional process. So it's not something people would have, but it's something they actually do and actively negotiate with one another. And then also what's more interesting for this talk is that in the original definition, Altman also points out that it might also be something groups do. But then later research hasn't really been picking up on that group side of the issue as much. Mostly we would always be thinking about what individuals do to work for their privacy and achieve the levels of interaction they're looking for, but then it's less clear what would it mean for a group to engage in these negotiations. And so Altman's idea is that people have this desired state of or level of interaction with others, and then they make different kinds of efforts to achieve that, and they may succeed or fail, but those successes or failures can both go to the direction of achieving too much or too little, and both are equally problematic. So it's also not just a question of drawing boundaries in the sense that I now restrict something or a group restricts something, but it can also be this process of actually actively trying to open up. And so all of this, as it was created in the 70s, originates from thinking around physical spaces. And there, if you think of boundaries, houses would be an easy example to start with. So we have walls and windows and doors, and all of these do some kind of work for what kind of access is granted, and different spaces at different times are used for different purposes, and people might have a pretty good notion of like when and which spaces are to be used together and separately and so on. But then the physical boundaries, that one I'm not sure how much you can actually see of the picture. It's a photo from the Finnish Lapland, and there's a tent somewhere down there in the area that looks dark to me. I don't know if you can't see it, but there you would have another notion of like even the physical boundaries don't have to be as permanent as you would think of in a building, but it's something that can be kind of flexible and temporary and set up as need be. And also at the same time, in the physical spaces, these things serve for privacy needs. They're also doing other functions. So a tent, if you're somewhere out in the woods, would not necessarily be there as much to have a little privacy from the outdoors, but it's also protecting you against the weather and so on. So these things get intertwined. But then there's more to it, so it's not just the physical space, but there's also all kinds of social and cultural ways to negotiate the boundaries, and they can be verbal or paraverbal, as here. And if you think of riding the subway, that's a really interesting space to see some of that work happening, where people kind of turn away from others and towards others and mark their territories. They might place a bag on the seat next to them so that they can keep a little bit more of a private space to themselves and so on. So it's really all kinds of different things people do to go about their privacy. But then how does all this tie back to our interest in technologies and social media? So there's been work then applying Altman's notions over to the network domain, some of which we all in this room have been doing, and I think the most known part of bringing Altman to the era comes from Leisha Palin and Paul Durish, who wrote a paper about how do these ideas apply to understanding privacy in the networked era, and thinking about what changes once we have all kinds of digital technologies in place, and how does negotiation work out then. And also then other folks like Dana and Helen Nissenbaum have been doing a lot of work looking at similar issues, not necessarily from the Altman point of view, but tying back, and here now I'll be more focusing on social network services, as Couchsurfing can be thought of as one of them. And thinking back to what does it mean that we have these profiles that are more or less public, they're more or less persistent, replicable, scales become different, there's mediation, there's all kinds of new things in place. And there's been quite a bit of work looking at different services, looking at what does it mean if we have different kinds of mechanisms for sharing content. So for instance, on Last.fm you can just stream all of your listening behavior to your profile automatically. You don't need to be deciding like, I want to let my friends know that I was just listening to this song. And then even there we would end up seeing people making efforts of like, well, but I would actually like them to think that I was listening to this music while I was actually listening to something else. And all kinds of work go into it. So it's not like once sharing becomes more easy, it doesn't necessarily mean that it comes easier in the sense that you wouldn't need to go through the work of privacy. And here often the work would be mostly focusing on people's practices on the sites and in the domain of like what happens online. And some of it does definitely acknowledge that these are tied back to all of the things that happen offline as well, and often people are interacting with the same people online as offline, so those connections are there. But then this summer I wanted to make a more precise look into how do then the efforts online and offline fit together in the context of Couchsurfing, and then also how do groups go about negotiating boundaries. So what could we learn of looking at groups instead of the more common focus on individuals. And so this brings us now to Couchsurfing. So just to give you some quick notions of what it is. So it's a hospitality exchange service where people can offer to host others, typically people they don't know beforehand, in their homes, or then also request to stay with others when they're traveling or whatever the need may be, maybe moving into a new place, like one of the participants in my study who were going through this whole process of moving to Boston, and then they had in the first week stayed with Couchsurfing hosts, which had been for them a really good way to get started in both looking for an apartment, but then also in terms of finding some people to connect with and get more to the social aspects of what's happening around here. And I'm not sure, I think the tagline isn't probably readable from here, but what they're saying is that it's leading social travel and it helps you to meet an adventure with new friends around the world. So while there's this whole idea around organizing places to stay, it's clearly framed as something more and something where the social aspects are really important. And then another clip, so this all comes from Couchsurfing's website as they're reporting their community themselves. So you can see a little bit of the age range mostly people in their late teens, 20s, 30s, but still ranging quite broadly and generally somewhat balanced between genders of participating. And 46% of the people who have profiles up on the site are also offering to host others. So there's quite a few people who are willing to go into this activity that might sound somewhat weird, that you are welcoming strangers to your own home. Like, why would one do that? So that's interesting to know. And then also what's good to know about the site, and which was a good entryway for the study, is that they are one that allows people to set up profiles that are explicitly about several people. So when you create an account, you have to make a choice between being male, female, or several people, which there could be a lot to say about that division. But what's interesting for this case is that they actually are welcoming people to be representing a group of people in one profile, which is not necessarily what most SNSs would do. And so more precisely, what I was looking at is that how do households of more than one person jointly regulate access to both their domestic spaces and interaction. So these go hand in hand, as we will soon see, but making the point that it's not just about opening the door to your home, but it's also about engaging in interactions with the people who then enter. And then some details about this study itself. So I was making semi-structured interviews. Most of them took place in the participants' homes, so in the very same spaces where they actually host also the couchsurfers who come. And they were recruited mostly through the website. So a screening for several people profiles, and then contacting them to ask whether they would be willing to participate, and also asking them to pass along the invitation to everyone in their household. So just in case it was just someone who's in charge of the profile, to make them understand that also whoever they're living with is welcome to participate. And that was more or less successful. So I think about half of the cases I did get to talk with everyone or almost everyone in the household, and then in other cases might be just one person or part of the household who participated. And all in all, I did interviews with 17 people from 9 different households. You can see the gender split and ages there. Most of them were heterosexual couples. One of the couples had a daughter who was 10 years old. And then there were 2 households that consisted of housemates. So these were the kind of households that come together either with friends living together, or then another one was one of Craigslist's creations of like people looking for others to share a house with. And then about the contents of the interviews. So I wanted to narrow in on what their experiences had been with the site and through the site of hosting. So going through of how did they first get started, how did they create the profile, how do they maintain it, who does that. Then also how do they negotiate particular cases of hosting when they get a couch request, which is what people can send to others when they want to stay with someone. So who reads them, who responds, what makes them say yes or no, on what conditions, all of those kinds of things. And then also trying to tap into what had been some of the more burdensome or stressful experiences they had had. And then on the other hand, what makes it fun and rewarding? Why do they go on engaging with an activity like this? And so now I'll next get to the findings. So I'll be talking about 4 notions of what came out of the analysis. Maybe a quick word on how the analysis proceeded. So it was a kind of an open-ended qualitative process of looking at the data, reading and rereading, and iteratively coding it through. Definitely informed by theory, but then at the same time trying to remain open of talking back to the participants' experiences. So kind of trying to remain true to what they were saying and what their voice around these issues was, and not push it too much by the perspective I had going in with. And I'll have some excerpts from the interviews here. The pictures are again from Flickr not of the people, so they are not the participants in the photos. Don't be mistaken by that. And also everyone is presented behind pseudonyms, so they're not their real names, so that's just to protect their anonymity. But so what did I learn in this process? Well, first of all, something I already touched upon a little bit. So hosting was framed as this social activity and as an invitation to interact. So people were primarily going online. Some had begun or had been driven to the site by the need that they wanted to actually stay with someone themselves, and then they felt that they wanted to give back. And that way started hosting, but mostly people started because they wanted to engage in this activity and make new connections and meet people, and that was driving the whole process. And here we see Kevin, who was from one of the households of housemates, living with 4 other people, and he's telling about the best times it has been. So times when you can actually really connect with the people you're hosting and really see eye to eye with them and become friends. And this was common to how the participants thought about hosting. So this is what they were after when they decided to host. And then on the other hand, interestingly, people were talking a lot about then thinking of like when do they decide to host. So they got started because they wanted to connect, but then in deciding later on whether or not to accept visits, the notion of like, do we have the time to do it came up quite a bit. And people would say that if they were going through a stressful or like otherwise being really busy period, that they would be less likely to say yes, basically. Which is an interesting notion, because there really it becomes obvious that they were thinking of this more as a hobby than as anything else. So it's something that you can choose to do, and you do it voluntarily if you want to and when you want to. So it's not something that you would always have to be saying. And people were kind of fairly cautious of saying yes, so they wanted to make sure that they first of all had something that they considered to be sufficient in terms of space available for others. Many felt if they didn't have an extra bedroom or a different confined space for the visitors that they wouldn't want to host. But then even more so, people were thinking about whether they have the time and energy to interact with the guests. They felt really like if they're too busy and they just let them stay, then that's no good. Like that's not how it's supposed to be. And then they would be saying no. But then of course, reverting back to the reason of like we were busy was a way for them to just kind of politely refuse when they didn't want to, and when they wanted to put their own comfort in front of the list. And another thing that we see here with Jeff and Kate is the second quote from them, where they say that if either one of them didn't want to host, then they just wouldn't do it. And this was really common, that even if there was someone who was in charge of taking care of the profile, people typically would not invite anyone unless they had agreed on that with everyone in the household. And that leads to the situation also where the ones who want to host least often or to the least degree are the ones who kind of draw the boundary of how much hosting the household can be doing in the first place, because there was a strong notion that if someone doesn't want to have couchsurfers in the house, then there should not be couchsurfers in the house. So then that's kind of where power gets distributed. So like the right to say no goes beyond any other interest. And then looking a little bit more to the side where things were not running as smoothly, we see that that's also like interaction is also where the disappointments come out of. So Laura and Bob were a couple who had only hosted once, and the visitors hadn't really engaged with them, and they were now wondering like, well, do we even want to go, and like, did we understand somehow wrong what this thing is about, because these people were basically just using us for the space, and they felt that they had been treated like a hotel, and that wasn't what they were looking for at all in this process. And that came up in quite a lot of interviews. So while the hosts were requiring of themselves to have the time to interact, they also felt that a good guest is someone who is actually interested to meet them and learn to know them and interact with them and is willing to take the time to do that instead of just coming for the free place to stay, which is not what they felt this should be about. And that's kind of a good way to see the questions of too little and too much interaction in action. So people were trying to regulate the thing so that they would get to a given level of interaction, and as the whole reason why people wanted to host was to have more interaction, if that didn't happen, they felt really violated of like, well, this is not at all what we were looking for. Then to the next part. So looking at the boundary regulation mechanisms, it was obvious that they're functioning as a whole. That's something that I was expecting going in with, but then making things more interesting is the way they actually fit together. So there was a clear loop of how the regulation goes on. So people were using the online profile as a way to, in some ways, as a baseline. So they were using that to communicate what they wanted, what they had for offer, what were some of the rules and restrictions around like what they expected of the guests. And then also things like how long they would be willing to host someone, how often they wanted to host. The profiles allow people to pick whether they are more or less likely to agree to host, and that was used as a way to filter out like how many requests they would be receiving. But then at the same time, the experiences of like once the online part of agreeing to host someone had succeeded in the way that someone is actually coming for a visit, people would then go through the hosting experience, and sometimes things weren't working or something was working differently from what they expected, and those kinds of things would then lead them into making updates to the profile. And what was happening basically is that like once the host had decided that okay, we'll do this, they were always trying to be very tolerant of the guests they had accepted to receive, even if they were doing things that felt like this is not what we wanted. One example was a couple who had received 4 college students, and that had turned out to be a little bit more overwhelming than they had expected. And after the visit, they were like, all right, we can't be hosting this many people at once, like we're running out of water, but then also it's just like it makes it impossible to go about our daily lives if we have this many people in the house. The female in the couple was mostly working from home, so for her especially it had been a struggle to get stuff done when they had all of the visitors in the house. So then but it was interesting that there was definitely this sense of we won't really make confrontations with the guests while they're there. That was more like, well, we signed up for this and we decided to let these people come, so we'll just now have to somehow deal with that. But then once the guests were gone, they could go and change things for future occasions. So the profile was used to prevent basically from any uncomfortable experiences from happening, and with more or less success, but mostly it seemed to be working well. Then coming to the part of regulating together as a group, there are clear signs of both delegation and cooperation. So people would divide tasks around hosting. It was quite common that there was someone in the household who was in charge of the online account, who would be the one who would be making updates to the profile, who would be reading the requests, responding to them, and taking care of the coordination before visits. And this was something that was also emphasized by the way Couchsurfing is designed, because they allow you to have one email address to which all of the messages you're receiving within the service will be redirected. And then that basically was emphasizing the tendency that someone becomes a gatekeeper, because then if you're the one to get access to the emails, then you're likely to be the one who's also responding to them. And people negotiated differently around how to go about it. So here's Jeff and Kate again, and they were about doing this very much together as they're saying, they would definitely always look at the request and talk about it together before one of them would respond. They were also the one household in the study who had made a hack to get around the email redirect system. So they had set up a new email account to which the messages were forwarded from Couchsurfing, and then from there on they were using that account only to then redirect to the email addresses of each of them, so that they could actually get the messages at the same time and have equal access to that. But most households weren't doing anything like that, and then they were either struggling a little bit with the fact that they didn't have as much access, but for the most part people felt fairly okay about someone taking care of the account and then forwarding the messages to others or filtering them out and only bringing the like promising ones to discussion with others. So there was a lot of division of tasks in that sense. And here we have another example. Christina was living with her partner and their daughter, and she's saying she was one of the ones who would be filtering out the requests the family was receiving. She was very much in charge of the profile because her partner wasn't that keen on hosting or was even somewhat reluctant to do that. So she was carefully trying to pick out the requests that thought could be interesting for John and then bring them into discussion. But she too is here saying that she couldn't still, even if it was clearly her task to take care of Couchsurfing, she couldn't go and accept anything without discussing with John. But then also interestingly, as for the daughter, she felt that it's more about offering notice, so it was enough to inform her of visitors coming in, apart from cases where they needed Stephanie to give up her room so that the guests could stay there. And in those cases she felt like, well, then she should have a discussion with Stephanie and get her permission. She had once done this without permission, and that had led to some unhappy discussions between the mother and the daughter. So that was also a learning process of like, even if the child doesn't get to decide about the whole household and access to like who gets to stay with the family, they could still have some spaces within the house where they have the rule. And then we have Jenna and Simon here showcasing how then once the guests were in the home space, these household members would engage in turn taking. So Jenna is explaining how it's good to be hosting together with her partner, because then you don't need to feel that you're stuck with the guests. You can go and do your own things, retreat for a little bit, or if you need to go and take care of some other responsibilities, you can do that without feeling that you're abandoning the guests and not living up to the expectations of interacting with them. And this was quite common in different forms, and it intertwines definitely with how the home spaces were used, in the sense as well that people could then retreat to their home offices, or in the case of the housemates, everyone would have their own room, and if someone wanted to be away from the guests for a while, they could always retreat back to those spaces where the guests weren't expected to enter. And another way groups negotiate together comes out in the rare cases of there being something that comes close to a conflict or something that needs to be addressed with the guests. And Kevin here, who was in charge of their profile and was taking care of mostly coordinating the visits of Couchsurfers, is talking about house guests in general. He didn't really feel that there's difference between whether it's a friend of one of the housemates or a Couchsurfer coming in. So this was a household who was commonly on a weekly basis pretty much receiving people, and it was normal for there to be people around who don't permanently live in the house. But what Kevin is saying is that he would not go to a housemate's guest and address an issue, but he would talk to the housemate and ask them to take care of it. And a similar thing was also happening in the household of Christina and John that we saw a moment ago, where if John was unhappy about something, he would talk with Christina and ask her to go and deal with it. So in this way, even within the home space, some delegation was happening, but mostly though, as soon as the guests were in the home space, people would more go into this cooperative mode where everyone would be interacting with the guests, and everyone would also have a say about what spaces are used and how are those used, because it's so much more than immediate in the daily life of the household that it was basically hard not to be involved. And then finally comes the part of access to domestic spaces being both spatially and temporally nuanced. We've already seen some little signs of that in terms of there being spaces within the households where it would be someone's room that they get to have a say over, even if the common spaces are regulated differently. And then also time was playing into it. People were fluctuating in how many visitors they wanted to receive. Kevin, who we just saw, was explaining how their household would go through these little sprees of hosting a lot, get sick of it, take a break, then host again once they felt like it was fun again. And there, in that fluctuation, we can see how the framing of this activity as a hobby comes in again as well, where if you don't feel like it, you don't have to go on doing it. And then when it comes to the domestic space, it's also really important to be clear about that the choice of making the home accessible is not a binary one. So it's not just like we opened the door and now they're in our home, but there's actually all this nuance around which spaces in the home are accessible to whom and when, and who's interacting with whom and all that. So here we see Jenna, who I was mentioning before, in her experience of hosting for college students. And while they were hosting as well to have interaction with the guests, and that was something that was valued, then during the day when she needed to work, it became a problem that the guests didn't realize that this is not the time to be interacting. So the temporality kicks in here, where something that is actually looked for and wished for and valued at one time becomes a problem at another one. And a similar case from Christina, where she was talking about a family who once stayed with them and was cooking basically all of their meals in the kitchen, and she hadn't realized before that they would be doing as much of it. And she goes into this beautiful line of like they were really respectful, but they were still taking up space and time, where while she was happy to let the guests use the kitchen, when it got to the point that she couldn't go and cook dinner for her own family because the guests had taken up the kitchen, then it became a problem, and they needed to go into this little negotiation of like who cooks and when and how to go about it. Bathrooms are another example of how these things play into the picture, where they would also need to be shifted in like who's using them and when, and especially the mornings could be a time when there was more demand for the bathrooms than space, and some kind of turn taking would need to take place there too. And then we have Kevin again explaining about how they would only want to be hosting when they can put up the house in a good enough shape, which ties back to the whole point of taking breaks when you don't feel like hosting. So there was this effort going into being able to be a good enough host, and people would then think about whether or not they were willing to make the efforts of that to achieve the interaction they wanted, or at times they also didn't want the interaction, so that fluctuation was happening. And the thinking around what is enough and how good of a host you need to be so that you can call people in was something that many households were struggling with quite a bit and thinking about it a lot. And it was interesting because some of them were even reflecting on it themselves, like if they had been couchsurfing themselves, they had always been happy with like whatever little corner was provided to them, like they would never moan, and they felt that as a guest they should never be dissatisfied by what is offered. But then when they were thinking of hosting themselves, the standard was different, of like, well, if we don't have a separate room for them, then maybe that's not enough, and a lot of insecurity in those terms. There, and so I'll soon wrap up. But coming back to the core notion, so what was seen, and thinking a little of like how is this applicable beyond couchsurfing, which is a somewhat specific case, of course. There are other sites that are doing similar things. Airbnb, while it involves money, would be definitely bouncing into some of the similar issues around how the space gets negotiated. But so first, there's the notion that online and offline are really integrated, and that the efforts really fit together and function as a whole. And thinking of it as a loop as well might be something that could inform understanding of other sites as well, where things happening in both realms could also not just be reflected in terms of what can be shared later on, say on Facebook, but also in terms of like what happens actually changes the way you want to go about regulating the other part. And then looking at groups, there's the notion that there's delegation and there's cooperation, and I didn't really have enough of households and different types of households to start addressing what that would mean for like how is it different if it's a couple or if it's a family with children or if it's housemates, though there's definitely different senses around that. And the one thing that was clear in this study was that people would be thinking of the home as a whole and as a social space much more if it was a couple who was making it open, whereas the households where the housemates were living tended to be more easygoing in terms of like, well, everyone can kind of come and go, and the living room space wasn't as sacred as it seemed to be to some of the couples. And then finally thinking of access to domestic spaces and how this time and space plays into the picture in nuanced way, and all of these end up tying together, of course, as well, where if someone is in charge of all of the online parts, then that means that they are the ones who are taking care of it, and others aren't, and then that might be reflected in how the others feel that they can get involved in the offline parts of the process. But I'll wrap up here and open for questions. Just some acknowledgements to finish up with. So, wouldn't have been possible without the participants who were kind enough to welcome me to their homes, but also wouldn't have not been possible without Mary and Nancy, who've been mentoring me quite a bit, and all of the SMC. So thank you for that, and let's take some questions.
So I'm told we don't have to go Donahue style on this, that mic is going to pick up our Q&A. That's what I hear. There's a mic right there.
Yeah.
So if people would just be demonstrative in their question.
I mean, I'll ask loud, ask proud. I will ask loud and proud.
Is there any other way?
Thanks. So I'm really interested in, especially in light of yesterday's talk, some of the norm setting that we've started to think about in terms of your participants having different ideas, and they all sort of edged around this idea of being present or whatnot. But to what degree did they try to signal some of this in the profile? And how did the profile serve as a signaling of some of this boundary work that you were seeing?
So yeah, it was used quite a bit, where like if we think back to Christina, one of the things she had done was that like she was being very explicit with the profile of going like, these are the spaces. There was a couple of different options of spaces in their home where the guest could stay. Yeah, but yeah. Okay. But then going forward also, like she was giving all this information about the family as well, and then she had a line where she named the pets of the family, and after that line she was like, if to signal that you have read through the whole profile, name the pets in your couch request so that I can know that you actually went to the trouble of reading through. So she wanted to make sure that the guests would know the expectations, and then more commonly people would be listing out what they were looking for in the couchsurfing, that they were interested in meeting people, and maybe list out some of their interest in terms of the activity. So like, well, these are the things we could do together, and that kind of work where they would make it clear. But then in terms of the space, like, we need you to be out of the house between 9 and 4, that kind of stuff I don't think was happening as much. So there's definitely a lot of space where like people would be relying also on these expectations that aren't necessarily shared, where like, well, it's just common manners to do certain things until it becomes obvious that the common manners aren't that common after all.
Especially with travellers, because people are coming from different cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think I had a similar question, but from a slightly different angle. Because when you use the word delegation, of course, my mind immediately went to Latour, and I immediately started thinking about how that stuff is embodied in material objects or materiality that sort of enacts social and, become social and moral actors in the space. So rather than online, were there ways that the kind of actual sort of materiality of the space was enacting certain forms of boundary work? I don't know, keys, doors.
Yeah, doors.
This
doors
is
definitely.
guest bedding, this is our bedding, and
Yeah.
I don't know, or the network, like, is everything open wireless, or do they sort of, like, just sort of, is all how the materiality?
Yeah, so the network was actually something I asked about, and most were like, no problem. We of course give them access. Most travelers apparently go around with their own devices, so there wasn't as much of the sense of like, do we need to give over our computer, which I think in the cases that was happening, people were a little bit more itchy around doing that, because then of course once you hand over your laptop, there's all kinds of access to to your life that you wouldn't necessarily want to hand over to someone you just met 15 minutes ago, or even to your partner in many cases, I guess, would be not happening. But then in terms of the physical space, doors were definitely something that was playing into it, and people felt like it's, in most cases they would have at least, like, I think that was coming up most in terms of bedrooms and sleeping spaces, where people were really strict around like the guests and the hosts are not to be sleeping in the same spaces. The only case where that would be happening that I heard about in the interviews was when the family with the daughter was hosting another family, and then the children could share the space and have a little slumber party. But then between adults, that seemed to be like something they would not want to do, and they preferred there to be doors. And then like that's where the intimacy talk came up a lot. And there were two couples who were living in apartments that were more laid out as open spaces, and then one would see like they had curtains to narrow out spaces, or walls were laid out in ways that would effectively lead into having different rooms. But then of course it's like audio-wise and in many ways, like, you don't have that same clearness as with the door that you can close.
But it sounds like it wasn't a lot of new material or material practices that got deployed when guests were there. Were guests just integrated into the existing?
I'd say so. Yeah, for the most part they were. Also, I think it's partially by virtue of like who are the people who host. So then most households already had the kind of layouts where they would have a separate guest room or a living room that they could give over to the guests, and then they wouldn't need to go into changing their own practices as much by having the guests around. Then the keys were another interesting thing, where some were feeling like, of course we can hand them out, others not so much. And then there were some cases where they were like, we're just going to be with the guests all the time, so they won't need the keys, which was like, I think they were consciously thinking of doing it in terms of just to be really good hosts, like that's the experience the guests are looking for, that we're just going to go and tour around together. But then of course at the same time that leads to the case that you don't really need to trust the guests because you're with them at all times, so they're not going to be in your space without you there at the same time. Not sure if that answers, but yeah, I think those were the
Sounds
main.
like the kitchen was a kind of disruptive space, and the pots and the pans and the dishes, and that was
Yeah.
some tough to negotiate materiality.
Yeah. But that was mostly I think in terms of times, and it didn't come up with that many households as a problem, because often the visitors would not be cooking, or then if they did, they would be cooking all together, where like, we want to make you a traditional meal of our country as thank you for having us stay, when then it becomes a different issue.
Part of what makes my question a little odd maybe is it's something I would never do. So it's very foreign.
Yeah.
So my imagination starting place is kind of materiality enacting the boundary between guest and home person, home owner.
Yeah.
And I guess what's less clear to me in your data is that designation of guest actually a meaningful one? Like, is that an identity that the hosts try to set up for people, or is it something other than guest? Is guest, what are these people? Are they? You have friends. Friend came up in.
But I think guest would probably be the notion for that they were mostly using for thinking about
it was.
people. Like maybe if the visit was successful, then they would become friends, and then if the same people came back again, then it would be a different setup of like having someone visit. But there wasn't that much of it happening though, so it mostly guest I think would be the framing they were working under.
Did you ask some questions about them when they are the ones surfing and how they perceive the same kind of boundaries?
Yeah, I did talk with them a little bit about their experiences of surfing as well, and I think apart from 2 households, everyone had also played the role of the guest. But I think, what would you like to most know about
wondering
that?
the same expectations that they had as guests were transferred for them as hosts.
As host. For the most part, yes. I think the only clear thing that I can talk about where they were thinking about it differently is that, like, as a guest, they felt that they should not be really making any demands, and they should be feeling grateful and not criticizing the household. And then when they were hosting, they were much more concerned about, like, are they performing well enough as a host, even if as guests they would not be evaluating the hosts in terms of, like, well, they weren't really quite, like, I would have liked them to talk a little bit more over breakfast. That wasn't happening. So I think it's mostly that setup of setting up different standards of, like, how, but then again, it's in many ways it is the same standard, where in both cases people would want to be the ones who are polite and performing well, whether it's as a guest or as a host. So I think that's, yeah.
I have a comment related to the materiality.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not on couchsurfing, but I've actually, like, slept on people's couches, or people that I didn't know before.
Yeah.
And, like, what happened was that I was trying to leave as little material traces behind me.
Yeah.
So, like, if I was staying for more than one day, I would just, like, clear all my stuff off the couch and put it somewhere, like, in the corner or something.
Right.
Yeah,
and, like, immediately clean after myself in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's, like, that was my approach to it.
Yeah.
And I have a question that's sort of related to it. How does the design of the service actually promote this ethos? Like, the people are talking about their expectations, like what couchsurfers should do or should not do. How much is this, like, in the ethos of the people, and how does the self-presentation of the site sort of come into it? Because they're saying, okay, we are connecting people, not offering spaces.
Yeah.
How do people find it? Did they find it, like, changing? Like, is the function changing or stable?
Yeah. All right. So to the first part of your comment, that was definitely, I think, something that goes under the common manners understanding a lot of people had of, like trying not to be in the way of anyone else, and in the few cases where people were talking about what had been uncomfortable or what they had not been so happy with, was also ones where, like, if they had the guests stay in the living room, if the guests didn't realize that it's their space during the night, but then over the daytime it's again a shared space, and that kind of temporal transition happens, then it would feel uncomfortable for the hosts, like, I can't go to my living room because it's now somehow framed as a personal space of the guests. So that was happening, but then for the site, definitely there's a lot of, like, I think really strong framing happening by Couchsurfing around how they want to envision it and how they want to promote it and what kind of a picture they are putting forth of it. That's something I didn't really look into in depth. I was reading through, like, they actually have fairly precise and explicit lists of, like, if you're a host, these are the kinds of things you should think about. As a guest, think about this. This is how you write a good couch request. These are the things you should have in your profile, where they try to direct people into indicating their expectations more explicitly. I guess so that kind of work they're doing, and then definitely overall they're promoting it in terms of interaction and giving out that framing that it's this nice generalized reciprocity kind of community, which is, that was, and it was coming up a lot, I think, in asking people of how they decided to start and how they think about the site, that they were also kind of had heard and learned of that ethos of the site and were actually taking that as their baseline of their definition of what they were doing when they were hosting.
Just as a follow-up to that, so it sounds like you're saying that in the interviews, how much are you hearing them reflect back on what the site says good hosting is, and how much are they bringing? So I'm just thinking about Sal's talk yesterday. How much are they bringing a kind of localized understanding of what those rules of decorum might be? And I know we've had this conversation before. Of, like, how much can you tease out a sort of implicit middle-class value of hospitality that also has this sense of separate space, that, you know, to have separate space in this area particularly says something about somebody's economic means. So if you can just relate, how much are they seeing what's on the site as kind of universal, and what are the particularities of what they see as hospitality?
Yeah, I think in many cases it's really hard to tease apart those two, because they wouldn't be saying, like, well, we read on the site that this is how it is, but and most had, like, when they had learned about Couchsurfing, it had been through friends and others, so then it's already kind of, I'm not sure how many of them had gone through all of the documents on the site to reflect back on it, but based on what they were saying very similar things that are the ones that the site is putting forth, so then it seems like there is that connection happening, but then at the same time those sets are close. I imagine what is the kind of more general understanding, at least in the States, of how things run. So I think there's this combination of.
I think you can often tell by when they say, I couldn't believe that they crossed such and such a boundary, because that was a taken for granted boundary. So actually it emerges not from their general conversation, but from where they think somebody else transgressed a norm that they thought was obvious. So it's in those kind of you broach the tacit rule, you know, and you don't know that it's there until you break it.
And this study definitely.
But you don't know that you have it until somebody breaks it.
And this was definitely, I think, bumping into the same problem as some of the work I've done on Facebook, where as long as things are going more or less okay, people can't really talk to what they expect or what the problems would be, and especially in terms of the home space, because it seemed that the profiles were doing such a good work of regulating what was going to happen, and then the rest of, like, the little that there were problems, people would get carried through that by the sense of tolerance, like, well, we decided to do this and it was a voluntary thing, so it's cool, like it's supposed to be a little challenging to encounter these people.
Is there a rule about money, like about you should be paying for meals or you shouldn't be paying for meals, and is that ever made explicit? Because I find that one of the most difficult things about travelling to other cultures is sometimes you're somebody's guest and they pay for everything and it's really embarrassing and you're just like, oh my God, let me pay for something, you know.
Yeah.
And they won't let you and it's like, oh, okay, so, you know, this is a cultural norm. But, you know, you go to other places and it's like, well, actually, we expect you to pay for everything. And for us,
yeah.
How do you know, you know?
Is
that written about in the profiling or is there rules?
Not in the profiles. Like Couchsurfing has pretty much a clear rule around like there should be no monetary exchange. Like you do it out of like it's a mutually rewarding thing. You do it because you want to, and then the reciprocity is seen to be functioning on the level of the community. Like if you host, then you get to stay with someone else and so on. But then definitely within the visits there would be a lot of work of this direct little smaller reciprocity in terms of like people wouldn't be paying to stay, but they would try to bring a little gift or make a meal or do those kinds of things. No one was saying that they would have had a problem with around issues of money, of like expectations around that not meeting, but yeah, definitely it could be one. I think for the most part though it's like it's such a clear indication again from the part of the site that it's like no money involved. Everyone's in it for their reasons, which are not monetary. But
middle class expectation.
Yeah.
We don't talk about the money.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, okay, there's 4 of you. You've just come to stay.
Yeah.
You can pay for your own food because you know paying for 4 people's food for 3 days. You know that's quite a whack.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and that's actually something we'll be talking with Mary of. Worth writing a follow-up to this study to look exactly into the reciprocity that is emerging anyways, even if it's supposed to be like we're just like none of that, and you see this interesting way the generalized and the direct part of the reciprocity fit together, where like you are working under this frame of like no reciprocity directly needed, but then at the same time it's clear that people wanted to feel acknowledged and they really enjoyed when someone brought them a little gift or like whatever it may be. And part of that I think is also the issue Jaro brought up of like if you're a guest, then part of the deal is that you're trying to make it as easy as possible on the part of the host, and that's also kind of a way to reciprocate. So
I would push back against the idea that it's just middle class norms. I actually think it's messier than that. And I think there's a class inflection point to it, but my experience, I mean, I haven't used Couchsurfing for a decade, and so I'm now just playing with it again for the first time in a long time. My experience with it is it had a lot of the same cultural baggage as things like Burning Man, which was about a rejection of monetary exchange as a valuable way of interacting with somebody. And so then it tried to basically impart on it these notions of gift exchange, which have all sorts of class baggage to them, but they're not so clean as to be middle class. There's something messier to it than that, and I don't know how to get my finger around it.
Well, I think the transnational piece, and so I was going to ask you to draw out like within the emphasis on the meal that you're making is from your culture, like the kind of commodification of otherness that's in the works here. I don't know if you want to speak to that, but that emphasis on it's not just making a meal, it's making a finished meal.
Yeah.
You know, and what's happening in that moment, at least in this context.
Yeah, like fish.
And I mean, where that might come into conflict if, you know, the typical dish of your homeland is something that the person hosting doesn't read as appropriate to your homeland. So I'm thinking anybody visiting from the UK who would make a really amazing, you know, Pakistani meal, and that would be a perfectly appropriate, you know, thing to make in the UK. That I might say is like, wait, why aren't I getting boiled potatoes and bread pudding? You know, I'm lucky I'm not. I don't know if you want to speak to how much does that come to the fore in the interviews that you did, that the emphasis is also on an otherness that's being exchanged.
A little bit of that, and it was an interesting thing because people like it's so cool to use this thing because you get to meet people who are like really different and all kinds of exchanges, but then actually when they were picking out the people they wanted to host, they were most prone to want to host ones who were their own age, who shared an interest with them, and those kind of, or then if there was someone really cool, like if someone was doing something so distinguishable that they would actually like, even if otherwise they would be saying no, but if there was someone who sounded super interesting, then they might decide to do it. So there's definitely a little bit of like, if we get to host people who are bringing some value based on who they are or where they're from, different countries, and then I had some people who were not from the States originally, and for them it could be like if there's someone asking from their own country to stay with them or someone who could speak their language, then that would be preferable, because then also you get to practice your French or whatever it may be, and those kinds of things would definitely be playing into how interesting a guest is and like what the value of the guest is. So there's definitely a little bit of that. Yeah.
One thing I thought I'd bring up, just considering the conversation, so one of the things that's explicitly stated on the site is before you arrive, find out if you need to bring food with you. Then it's got you may need to buy groceries and bring them ahead of you, especially this is about rural stuff. Even if your host offers to let you eat with them, you should plan to contribute as well.
Yeah.
And this is sort of an interesting like.
I'd love to see the modification of that language over the growth of the site.
Yeah,
I'd love to see how that.
Well, this is specifically also really heavily about the rural, like the special things you need to do to go to a rural
Which
site.
is ironic considering how much of this seemed to focus on access to public transportation, or the places that somebody's hosting are all about convenience or accessibility.
Yeah,
it seems.
yeah.
At least in this
but
project,
I
which
mean,
is
look at where we are.
Yeah, that's also like if we would have been
right.
purposely
We're in
sampling
the
for
French countryside.
a different type of a set, yeah, then you could
Yeah.
you could find that. But definitely then again in the metropolitan areas it was a selling point on the part of the host, like if they have a good location then that makes them a more desirable host.
Nobody wants to go to a
Yeah.
city and be stuck in a suburb.
No.
Yeah.
Well, you don't know what you're in for depending on where you are. I mean, where you're coming from, you might not know.
I wanted to ask kind of a theory question, but
Mhm.
shifting gears quite a bit from what we've been talking about. You set the study up in terms of privacy,
Yeah.
and of course you did that from the start. But as I listen to it now and having read through the draft, it seems like you're talking about something broader. You're talking about boundary negotiation.
Yeah.
And that's
yeah.
about who will I interact with, under what circumstances will I interact with them, who gets to decide whether or not we interact, who decides where we interact, and how much we interact. And that seems broader than privacy. So I'm wondering to what extent you think what you've ended up talking about in the analysis and in the findings is about privacy, and how much it's about other things that are getting negotiated. Does privacy encompass all of what you're seeing there?
It's a really good question, because I often, even in my other work, wonder whether privacy is the right word at all, because like boundary regulation seems to be what's happening, and then like that's one way to define privacy, but then if we have kind of a more intuitive sense of privacy, then it's different, and then also like boundary regulation is a really precise way to look at it, and then and I think it does spill over into regulation of boundaries that aren't necessarily only about the access or inaccess to interaction, because there's also like, especially in a home space like this, you would have all kinds of other stuff that is connected but not necessarily the same, where like if you're negotiating over like material resources of like who gets to use the kitchen at what time, is not necessarily a question of do I need to interact with the guests if they're in my kitchen. It can be more around what can I do with the space.
It's not just interaction boundaries, but if we're talking about what am I allowed to do in the kitchen, is privacy the right term for that? And I guess I'm wondering what is the right umbrella term to talk about all of this, because some of these issues are privacy, some of them are interaction, some of them are space management. There's different sets I almost think that your research question ends up really being what are the boundary issues and how do people manage them, and privacy is a subset there, which pushes me to wonder what should the other sets be labeled.
I was going to push you on the, I'll do the mean question. So why does this matter? What's the significance of this? Because then I could I totally want to champion your argument that for the most part, privacy is used as the umbrella term when we're having these conversations about no, I'll stop there. Why? Why does this matter? Why should we use boundary regulation instead of privacy?
Why to use one over the other? I'm not sure if I would want to talk to that, but why understanding privacy also in these terms or looking at this side of the discussion is useful. I think even in just in terms, if you think of back to the online domain, it so easily gets back into this discussion of like how do I as an individual restrict access to information about me, and then that's just, to me, seems like a very, well, it's a different issue, but then also it's a weak way to frame how people actually experience their social lives, insofar as the information is something that is actually interpersonally produced and ties back to all kinds of social relations, and it's not a set of more different type of an information where the connections to social life would be maybe weaker. Though I also, this is a ground where I'm kind of with a lot of open questions myself as well around like making the distinction between the more informational and interactional privacy. How much does that even make sense? Because then those two get connected together as well, and the informational part matters in many ways because it has implications for the interpersonal side and vice versa. Like if we only look at Facebook in terms of what's happening between the users and disregard the part of what's happening between the users and the site and all of the other parties in the equation, then we might not be doing a very good job of understanding what's happening and what we possibly should do about it or how to design for it or all of that.
Now I'm thinking about face work and politeness and the concept of negative face and being the freedom from unwanted imposition and the ability to, the right, as it were, to say, no, this is where my boundary stops and you don't get to impose on me anymore. Or, oh, I know, I feel imposed on, right? So in the kitchen could easily be read as a challenge to negative face because it's an unwanted intrusion on space they feel like they manage. So are privacy and face the same thing? Is privacy and negative face the same thing?
I don't think I don't think they are.
I don't think they are.
If I get your question, I think more like maybe what boundary regulation aspect could bring into the broader discussions around privacy in terms of interaction and social relationships is that there's like a lot of work is looking at self-presentations and looking at the face work, and then it easily disregards the fact that there's also like that's happening for the sake of having interactions and like how does it maintain relations, and focuses kind of overly much on the part of how do people brand themselves online basically, which is a really interesting set of questions, but again doesn't cover the whole social set of issues, what's happening. So then that I think is kind of where I feel like this could add into the self-presentation, and then definitely also it ties back to it pretty directly if we think of the example where Kevin is thinking that they need to clean up so that they won't come off as complete slobs. That's like self-presentation in action.
Yeah, and that's the positive thing.
Yeah.
I want to be the positive image of myself, and I want to do that on my profile, but I also need to protect my negative face and not have you intruding on me, and that's the balance that it seems like in all these scenarios people are trying to manage, is how do I project a positive face and have a boundary that stops you from intruding on my space and assaulting my face in that way.
This is why I'm feeling like, why are we holding on to privacy? It's like I feel like if I take Altman as the point of departure and imagine this is all about boundary regulation, I think the negative. I haven't even heard that phrase before.
Negative face?
Negative face.
Well, so Goffman talks about face both as positive self-presentation but also not being intruded on. And then Brown and Levinson in their politeness book do this whole, there's positive face and negative face. And so that idea of face has these two sides, one of which is self-presentation and carrying out a line that others will give positive regard or whatever Goffman says about it. But then negative face is this freedom from unwarranted intrusion harming you.
Well, those are the places where I feel like that can't be accomplished without some other points of pressure that are social. So I can't really accomplish the negative face on my own. Like it's always
exactly.
So that's where I feel like privacy just
when you're alone, you have no negative face issues at all. But you don't have any positive face issues either, right? Because you're not putting on a positive.
Except for the ones I'm imagining. I mean, I can definitely. I feel like.
Well, but you could be imagining negative face too. You could be by yourself going, oh, there's so many things I have to do. All those emails that I'm not looking at. All those messages I don't want to. I mean, so you could feel.
No, I think it's more that I feel like these are the rich places we go when we're thinking about what are the things people are doing, as opposed to privacy. Privacy feels like a concept that's awfully hard to keep in the conversation of practice. Like, when are we doing privacy? And I feel like that's been, it maps onto critiques of the public versus the private sphere. I mean, so this is where I'm like, why aren't we pushing for just letting go of the centrality or
defining it more precisely? I don't know the way to let go of it, but
I haven't heard a good case for keeping it.
Really?
No. I mean, because I always feel like I end up talking in these really particular terms of negotiation, of something that looks much more, I always feel like I'm doing this. Like, I don't know what privacy is, but it doesn't give me this. At least it tends to give me this sense of I have some sort of autonomy, or I have some sort of individual agency in this that just doesn't map onto what we see in the everyday experiences of these negotiations. So I'm more like, somebody give me a reason for holding on to privacy or giving it a more, I don't even know what the more precise definition of it would be.
I don't think we're going to win the more precise definition, given that there's a whole field that debates that.
Yeah.
But I think I would say that one of the reasons to hold on to it is that as a concept, it transcends different disciplines and has a different regulatory structure that actually is conceptualized as something that is in violation of social protocol to the point of regulation by law. And there are reasons to actually, and in terms of regulation of technology, and to think about the ways in which technology becomes a meaningful or problematic actor in the regulation of this. Once we move it purely to the social realm, we remove any responsibility of the technology or broader social structures in terms of regulatory forces. I'm not saying that this is, I'm giving you a reason. I'm not saying it's necessarily the reason for any particular project. I'm just saying there's a reason to go beyond just the kinds of social face work that we love to analytically work through.
To what extent, Dana, do you think that it's about information? Because when I think about, the technological, legal issues around it, it all comes down to who gets access to bits and bytes and I think content that's been posted.
And usually the my input of that. I think that's the possessive
It is
sense
one, but you're dealing with when the moment you get law, you have to think about individual harm.
I know,
the moment
is the
you
problem.
get there is
so I want to see individual harm kind of still come back to information that can be used in a way that harms the individual.
So this is the interesting thing. I think that the technology industry, the technology companies, focus it back to information as being the central element. I think one of the things I think is interesting in terms of more of a legislative approach, and again, I'm going to give an American-centric narrative to this, but one of the things I think is interesting in a legislative approach is that there is a different kind of harm that goes beyond information. And that harm has to do with the costs that it has, and it will be to the individual within a society, to lack opportunities or to have failings that, and this is where, for example, you get a Brandeis notion of it. So, for example, the idea of shame or embarrassment as a result of a violation of privacy is something that is regulatorily understood. I'm not saying, I would argue that technology companies are taking it purely to information. I think that the legislative world is taking it to some notions of interpretation.
Okay. If in that case, and I'm really just trying to understand here, I mean, it seems like that case still comes back to the harm was done by the violation of privacy, but the harm couldn't have happened if there hadn't been a violation of privacy, and the violation of privacy itself, can that take a form other than information about you was used in a way that created shame, created embarrassment, was accessed by somebody who didn't have some permission to have that information? Is there any kind of, for example, to go back to the talk, they were in my space, they came into my home, we don't prosecute that as privacy law, we prosecute that as trespassing. So does it ever legally even come down to something that doesn't at its heart involve access to data?
Oh wait, isn't the case of trespassing violation of your property.
It's a property issue.
Yeah, but it's
Is
not
that
in
necessarily
privacy, nobody would go after that under
Well,
privacy.
keep in mind that privacy law is.
But information is treated as property.
Yeah, and
But
that's
not
the
all.
whole,
Not always, but no, I'm sorry, I'm just feeling like.
The actual privacy laws are very limited, and the thing is that, but the thing is, the way that privacy is understood colloquially, even within a legislative framework, includes violation of property, violation, like search and seizure violation, it includes a whole slew of those things culturally. But I don't necessarily know that it, like, when you actually look at the actual privacy law, I mean, then you're down to, like, the fucking Bork law, and there's a handful of them, and that's, like, they're all very minutia. And other kind of, again, I'm getting a seriously American-centric view of this, because the thing is, outside of the U.S., there are very different ways of understanding privacy in the legislative framework. But I simply don't know them.
because I mean, one of the things that goes on in the online is that what is ephemeral in the offline becomes very concrete information and can then be product, not process. And then becomes subject to all these other kinds of regulatory mechanisms.
I still feel like they're kind of forced to conform to these very specific notions of information as privacy, or that it becomes a kind of information that then is coded. So if I'm thinking about a photo of someone's home, what is that when it's posted online for the person who's posting, or the names of the person's pets? Like, I'm just trying to think through if the concerns, if I fight for shifting the frame to boundary regulation is what's happening here, and privacy is this chimera of individual rights that's problematic in some ways, helpful in others, granted. But if I'm thinking about individual rights, it's also about boundary regulation and move the conversation, which I feel like IoT's project basically says most of what's happening here could be held within the rubric of boundary regulation and capture the nuance of what's happening and capture the sense of group negotiation. Then I gain something. I gain something by suggesting that certainly, whether it's a tech company like Couchsurfing, that it concerns itself with that regulation over and above thinking of an individual's privacy. If I'm thinking about it, how is it that there are relationships that are forming, and what's my role as a company within this, within these relationships that are forming? It gives a different sense, even if not sets of accountability. I mean, it's where when companies decide, I'm not liable for something bad that happens.
I mean, I don't know. This privacy stuff, it's not a word that ever comes up in my world of work, so it's very unfamiliar. So I'm trying to sort of access it from that end. So it seems to me, I mean, it's interesting, but in this case, it's only like this thin topmost layer, and it's the thing that a company could address. But it doesn't get at affect, it doesn't get at intimacy, it doesn't get at intersubjective phenomenology, it doesn't get at all the complicated stuff of everyday experiences with others. And so it makes sense to me that a company says, yeah, we can't get at any of that, so we're gonna do this layer that we call privacy, and I think Nancy's point about it's perhaps not the right umbrella term because it is the most narrowest of slices of intersubjective human experience, right? So then to me it's how do we talk about those other pockets, materiality, affect, intersubjectivity, like getting at, and then how technology gets wrapped up in that, which is also, I think, part of what Dana's initial question is signaling, is how is technology getting deployed to set a stage, and then how does that stage get mediated along the way? And so for me, that's why the privacy thing is like, well, okay, it's, but I don't know.
I guess for me, it's like it all depends on your interlocutors at the moment, right?
Yep.
Like, I am much more flexible about slippage around terms when it allows to speak to certain audiences that may not otherwise hear what you're saying.
Sure.
And so, for example, my stakes with the privacy work that I do are about purposefully complicating what legislators assume that to include and exclude because it's a language that I can have a conversation with them about.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not saying that it's actually the best analytically.
Exactly, I think that's.
I think that's one of the
Yeah.
challenges for you is
Exactly.
figuring who your interlocutors are and your point. Because I think that this project fundamentally isn't about privacy. Now, that said, talking to people who care about privacy may be
Absolutely.
part of your agenda. And so I think part of it is getting a clarity in your own head about when you're talking to who and what language is most helpful for thinking through it, both analytically and conversationally.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. No, and I think that's definitely also, it's kind of how I see it as well, where privacy often it serves as a term to like then you end up in the kind of in the community where you would want to be discussing a lot of these things where like even if this is kind of, I guess all of us agree that it's not really in the core of the privacy as dominantly understood, but then at the same time talking back to people who are working with that more dominant notion and trying to bring in the complication and make them see that there's all this other stuff happening that gets way more complex than the already super complex issues of how the information and restriction of access to it.
It does make me wonder for those
happens,
of you working
yeah.
in that space though, like what's the kind of end game of knowing that we hold some things more analytically complex than we hold when we're having those more pragmatic like what's the end game balancing act of those two things, if you get what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, that's why I can imagine, I see the value of very explicitly, and I think you do this, she has a lovely kind note that's awesome, and it goes nicely with this. But being able to say to those studying privacy, your concerns primarily revolve around information and individuals' capacity to regulate their information vis-a-vis people's access to it. So negative phase. I mean, that becomes it becomes the entire conversation. And to be able to push it out and say it's more complicated than that, and to point people's attention to Altman's notion that it's about regulating access to me and by extension to others, that it is precisely about invitations to, as much as it's about closing off. So privacy is thought of like I'm holding my cards as opposed to I'm trying to engage you in reading my cards. Like we don't think of privacy as that engagement. So I love the idea of being able to say to those who are focused on privacy as holding the cards to say, what is it that is the other part of that story? You know, it's other people who have cards on the table. It's what it is that we're negotiating as the decision to show each other who we are and what we have in those moments of opening up, as much as closing off. We only focus on closing off.
I mean, that's interesting because, of course, one of out of Altman, self-disclosure is like the keyest concept in relational theory of the last 40 years, but that doesn't really get tied really concretely to privacy.
Yeah. Well, I think in some places it does. If I think about all the conversation about, what is coming out.
Well, yeah.
So self-disclosure is.
But I guess, I guess what the way that I think it comes out to think about it in terms of the popular pragmatic discourse is,
which I'm not good at.
Because people are self-disclosing so much, it's evidence that they don't care about privacy. Right? And that's where people like Dana and us step in and say, well, actually, there's all kinds of layers to this, and of course they care about privacy, but maybe they don't think about it exactly the same way that you think they should.
I guess that's the pivot point for me. They care about access to them and to others. And that's where I have the hardest time holding on to privacy, because it's still this sense of disclosure that can't contend with the awareness that disclosure is always relational. Like, who knows, who doesn't, even if it's to myself. It's still to my imagined self, is who I imagine is going to see me. Like, all of the population that's in the mix is really hard for me to let go of that, because I feel like that's where the action is at.
I don't think I disagree with you, and this goes back to TL's question, which is that it all comes down to when revealing the complexity is pragmatically advantageous for helping somebody see from a different perspective, or when it closes them off to not even be able to hear you because you've now gone to a train of thought that they can't actually work with you on. And that slippage between like how you're trying to communicate your work, I think it's you make mistakes and you make decisions and sometimes they blow up in your face, right? And I think that's one of the challenges that I think for me, like I use a lot of terms that are local and trying to complicate things in ways that I just piss off other people. And I think that's one of the challenges as researchers working in this space, especially highly interdisciplinary spaces, which is who is it most important that you get to understand or complicate things? I mean, there's a joke at MSR that when all of this conversation about social media came up, Henry Cohn sort of said that, goes, I've never heard people say complicate and mean a positive thing before all of you. And I think there's some truth to that. Like a lot of what I feel like I'm doing is trying to complicate without losing. And that's a very delicate dance, and I fuck it up. And I think we will all fuck it up. And the question is how to actually do it in the most productive way possible.
Well, this wasn't my argument for Jettison using privacy. This was my argument for, in the conversations about privacy that have to move forward, and they are through those complications, because you're right, I don't think starting a new language and saying, we're just going to follow boundary regulation, we don't want to use that. Like, I don't mean that, but I mean in those moments where we feel that we're moving to a threshold where folks might be able to, and I think we're getting there, being able to imagine, so even having people think about big data, like that people are even thinking, wow, all of this information that about not just me, but where I go and what I'm doing is absolutely captured. Getting people to think about that, both in terms of, is that an invasion of privacy? What feels invasive about it? And mapping it onto other conversations, like that's where I feel we can go now. I feel like I'm hopeful that we can, and I'm sorry, we don't.
It seems like there's just two different levels going on here, right? And that one part of our job is to try to communicate to the public in a way that helps them understand and make correct, or at least wise decisions. Let me say wise rather than correct, because I don't think there is a correct, but make wise decisions, both as individuals and as groups and as societies and legislatively and on all those levels. We all want to sort of influence that discourse. As scholars, our job is to try to increase basic knowledge and basic understanding and basic insight, and in that regard, oversimplification is fatal.
But I think it's a question of who as scholars are we speaking to? Because when I talk to computer scientists, privacy means something boundary doesn't.
I understand that, but to say they don't have a word for it, so we can't go there theoretically doesn't help either, right? They got the word privacy from somewhere. They've got words that I don't know. That doesn't mean they're not worth studying. It doesn't mean they're not key issues. They complicate things in all kinds of ways. They just don't call it complicating. They call it hard, right?
Yeah, that's
so
true.
To say other people don't have these words, that's our job, is to invent language that allows us to grapple with the nuance, and some of it filters out to other places and some of it doesn't. And that's fine, just like that's how people specialize in expertise to make societies where not everybody has to know everything. That's what's supposed to happen. But I see our job as scholars as to really get nuanced, detailed understandings of what's going on and how it works. And I wouldn't expect mathematicians to be able to grasp all of that the way that we do. So that's why I think that it operates at two levels, one of which is to really try to unpack and understand in way more detail than almost anybody else in the world wants or needs. And the other is to filter that and communicate it to others and communicate with others and to engage other people where they are in productive ways. But those are two different levels that we have to move between, and I think it's really important that we don't merge them into one another in a way that shuts either one down, right? When you talk about you screw up because you bring in this more complicated language and people shut down and rebel and get pissed off, that's really important, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't go there. Rant over.
Can I
I think we should probably let Ari finish. We're now half an hour over. We should probably, it's 1:30.
So maybe one last question or comment.
Come on. No, mine can be for lunchtime conversation.
Well, join me in thanking Ari for her presentation.
Thank you.
Mine was going to be mostly for you, Sal, because I'm just thinking about, I don't know what you think, I think we never use this language in game studies, but games are rife with boundary crossing, boundary negotiating. So what is it about your domain that's made that, so is it simply, is it the power, I mean, do we need to?
No, I think it's that the premise of gaming is that it's social. So there isn't a conversation that I'm an individual with a private, the assumption is that even if I'm, playing some first-person shooter, that if I have a headset on, and certainly if I'm in some sort of network setting, I feel like it goes back to this, the imagination of an individual playing a game isn't there for a conversation about gaming. Our imagination of an individual within a social networking site is the point of entry for conversations.
Actually, there's a different issue at play, which is that most of the privacy conversations that have hit a lot of the social media hit because of a legal interest in personally identifiable information.
For sure.
And there is
As gotten by a company.
As gotten by
versus disclosed
correct.
by a gamer.
Well, but both. But the thing is, we can say that the gaming culture has been flawed logic-wise in terms of the legal folks, because they're like, well, there's no PII because people make everything up. That's the rhetoric I hear. You would argue against this, but that's the rhetoric I hear. That said, I have been hearing more and more conversation about regulating into game stuff because of the amount of interaction and big data stuff coming. So my hunch is you're going to get to see it really soon. And I think it will come from the legal frame first.
Because of a desire to collect that PII. I think that, well, that's what I meant. Like, I think the entry point for social networking sites is this is an individual who has some information.
Well, that's what I meant by power. That there's a base, then we just get back to kind of classic economic analogy. Right? There's particular companies that want to get access to particular data, and there's particular value to that data, so that's driving.
I think gaming has been able to make its money not on PII. It's been making it on participation. And social networking sites, they commodify.
Like Zynga, for better or worse, is probably going to be the entry point of fucking this up.
So they're going down from everything.
But I'm saying that genre of gaming, regardless.
Oh no, absolutely.
But the thing, should Zynga go properly down and sell off that data, all hell's gonna break loose. But I think Zynga's where I'm starting to see them really cranky, as opposed to the MMOs.
But it still has another economic means of supporting itself. It still has a different.
But then I think you actually just identified something really important, which is that formulation is coming from. I'm looking for you to chuckle, because I'm really just thinking out loud that notion of privacy. I'm not saying gamers don't think about those terms, but it's not an emic driving notion, right? And so then it's really important that I guess from your side, when you guys are doing that kind of work, and it's maybe your point in part or to flag that it's not that it's an emic driving notion from the community. It's actually a notion that comes from a certain economic configuration. I don't know. I mean, again, I hear.
would say that there are slippages, right? Like, and I'm particularly thinking about when Facebook decided to create the news feed. That their change in infrastructure. That resulted in a reveal that had not previously been experienced, got narrated and experienced by users as a privacy violation.
Well, when Blizzard decided to go for Real ID.
The Real ID, that's true. That was one place where the privacy hub.
Because there's a lot of anonymity in gaming.
Change is the weird one.
But I think are those.
I mean, I think if we so I was pointing, I read at one point to Lauren Berlant's arguments around, she's this literary scholar, makes this case that privacy are the places politically mapped out as where markets and the state can't explicitly go, and that's precisely what makes them exploitable. So her case is thinking about domestic violence. For a long time, it was considered that's something that's happening in the domestic space, that's private, that's happening between individuals, that's off limits from the state. So therefore, it becomes something marked as apolitical. And so, I love thinking of if privacy is always this construction of what it is we don't want to contend with. If that becomes, if we just mark it off, then having privacy at the ready is something people turn to in those moments when news feeds are releasing information. I don't even know if I would necessarily call that anemic. Like I'm thinking, what did people said creepy, and usually it's creepy. It's the word creepy, less than privacy violation. Like they're thinking, what? I don't want to know that. Like, is that about privacy?
People say that, but the moment the journalists pick it up, the journalists pick it up as privacy.
But I don't know if that's because they don't have any other framework.
Right.
I mean, legally, we
it's from within the journalistic community. It doesn't mean it's emic.
Yeah.
What's a better word than intimacy? Because I couldn't help but thinking of intimacy, but it's loaded in all the wrong. I was thinking about it. I just did an interview with a guy the other day, and he's a live streamer, and he has a all these live streamers, they just basically put cameras on themselves. And those cameras are often they're in their bedroom. So I was talking to him about, like, how are you negotiating, what you show, what you don't show, all this. Anyway, it came down to a discussion for him about whether or not people call him by his real name or his gamer name, right? And he had this whole thing about that, and it was clear it was about intimacy. He didn't use that word, he used other words. But he definitely didn't, it wasn't that privacy thing. It was something about